Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our September webinar, Navigating Right-of-Way and Land Acquisition Challenges in Capital Projects. My name is Corey Norton. I'm part of the sales leadership team here at Aurigo. And on behalf of the entire Aurigo team, thank you for joining us. We have a jam-packed agenda today with some great panelists. But before I get into introducing them, let me go over some logistics for today's call. As always, the webinar will be recorded and sent along with the deck to everybody who's registered for the event. And perhaps most importantly, we want to make sure that we cover as much of what you came here to learn as we can. So if you have any questions throughout the conversation, please make sure to submit them to the Q&A box. And at the end of the presentation, I'll be back to review them with our panelists. Speaking of our panelists, today we are joined by Carol Bellinger, who has worked in the right-of-way profession for over 38 years, managing large-scale public infrastructure projects across the nation. She's on the forefront of current technology solutions and approaches, such as best practices, quality control, and risk management in right-of-way. Carol builds, directs, and manages right-of-way teams for public infrastructure projects, including highway, transit, rail, airports, ports, and water transmission, ensuring compliance across federal, state, and local requirements. She served as the National Right-of-Way Director for a large engineering firm and is a licensed real estate broker in Illinois, Iowa, Kentucky, and Utah. We're also joined by Brad Hofer. Mr. Hofer graduated from Iowa State University with a Bachelor of Science in Construction Engineering. After a brief stint working in private sector right-of-way, he joined the Iowa Department of Transportation, where he's been an integral member of the team for the last 30 years. For the last 4 of those years, Mr. Hofer served as the director of the Right-of-Way Bureau, leading technology improvements, including geospatial, public involvement, and project management systems. And finally, as always, we're joined by our senior marketing manager here at Aurigo, Stephanie Pedroza, who I'll pass things over to right after a quick poll.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Corey. And actually, before we do the poll, I'm just going to go over the webinar, but welcome everybody from my end. And I am looking forward to this discussion. I'm pretty excited because we all know that securing the essential right-of-way for your capital projects is a goal that many public agencies seek. And acquiring that land that you need is never a simple process. So today, our panelists, we're going to discuss the right-of-way process, the challenges that go into the right-of-way process, how to integrate that into your capital programs, and then how technology can help alleviate that. But now we'll go to the poll question just to get to know who's in our audience. So if you can take a couple of seconds and just let us know what best describes your organization. And we'll give it a couple of minutes. Or not minutes, seconds. I always say seconds. It's always that silence with the poll questions that we never know what to say. All right, so it looks like about 50% already submitted, so we'll go on to the results. So we have a lot of people with roads and bridges, a couple of people with water and wastewater, transit and rail, very little with electric grid and green energy. So thank you guys for submitting the poll, and we have one more poll question. Can you please let us know what best describes your role? Are you a project manager, capital planning and finance, an engineer, consultant? Are you with real estate and right-of-way, or other? So take a couple of seconds, and if our audience can please submit the poll question. Right. So it looks like we have about 70%. So we'll show the results because we definitely have a lot of information. So a couple of project managers, the majority of them are real estate and right-of-way, several engineers. So thank you once again for joining us, and we will move on. So the right-of-way process, has just many moving components, and it's very, very complicated, but it's also a major component to completing major capital projects. And the process itself it's very difficult. And the graph above, we really try to simplify and kind of give a high level overview of how the process works. And I'm going to open up the discussion to our panelists. And Carol, I don't know if you can get us started. Can you let us know what are the crucial steps involved in acquiring right-of-way for typical infrastructure projects?
Okay, well, I start at the very beginning, even before we get the agents out there. For me, the key step in acquiring right-of-way is understanding your project funding and all of the requirements. Once you understand that, you can better put together your process for going out and doing negotiations, acquisition and relocation. So project funding, understanding the project and the community is next. You need to know your project, the policies and procedures, how you settle administrative, how you address counteroffers, administrative settlements, condemnation process, relocation appeals, and the impacts on the community. So for me, the funding, understanding the project and the community, and your project schedule and key milestones are the crucial steps in getting right-of-way off on the right track.
And Brad, I don't know if you wanted to add to that or just kind of go on the high level overview of the process.
The only thing I'd add to that is it's really crucial. I don't know, I'm a little parochial here, but it's really crucial that you even start before that. I feel like oftentimes by the time that it gets to the right-of-way acquisition process, it's kind of at the tail end of the development process to a large degree, unless you've been involved throughout. And sometimes the time that you had, the float that you had at the beginning of the project, is just as simply isn't there when you get to your process. So I'd add to that and just say it's really crucial that we maintain and manage that both the feed into your capital improvement plan, but also crucial that we manage the project throughout, so that the float isn't chewed up by the end, by the time you get to the end.
And have you noticed that the process changed just between various projects, or are there certain projects that change the process of the overall right-of-way?
I would say that we've got a pretty structured and pretty formalized process. There are certain projects that sort of test the limits of what you can do and what you can't do, but I'd say all in all, we're pretty structured in our process.
And Carol, just with working with other DOTs, have you seen the process been affected based on projects?
Yes, and again, I go back to funding, the source of funding. I always tell people, you get your funding, but you don't get something for nothing. And that really holds true for your infrastructure projects. You really have to look at your funding side and the strings attached to it and the requirements. For instance, FAA, if you get it it comes in form of a grant. The project has to meet those grant requirements. So your process and your procedures need to include those requirements to make sure that you have those requirements met throughout your project. Another example is FTA. They have, for instance, appraisals over a certain amount. The last time I worked on an FTA project, it was $50,000 on an appraisal. You had to involve the FTA, get an FTA approval, which required involving the FTA regional people. That is part of your process, and it has to be built into your process so that you make sure you're meeting those requirements.
And out of the whole right-of-way process, what would you find the most challenging? And I can let Brad take that one.
That's kind of a pretty open-ended question. There's a lot of challenges throughout the process. I think, we'll get into this in some challenges too, but I think the biggest struggle is, these days is really convincing folks of the need for a project. Sometimes I think in the past the public was somewhat accepting of kind of the higher good or or the need for a project without a lot of convincing. I feel like today that's not there so much anymore, or maybe it's a symptom of trying to do things too quickly. I feel like land is somewhat of a sensitive topic to a lot of folks, and so sometimes when you try to do things too quickly or encourage them to make a decision too quickly, a lot of times uh, the resistance is there not so much because they disagree with the project, but more because you're trying to make them do something quickly and with something that is near and dear to their heart a little bit more so. So I'd say that's one of the struggles we've had, is acceptance, general acceptance and support of the project. So I think people is another a real challenge these days in terms of land acquisition. We've got so I joined the right-of-way bureau in about 4 years ago in COVID, and I think at that point in time we were going through. I think we had about 40% of our staff that was set to turn over in the next 5 to 10 years. We were down to probably hired a lot of good people, and our team's down to about, I'd say, 15-16% now that could turn over in the next 5 to 10 years. That's always kind of a guess, but I think that's kind of a challenge too, because we're in the private sector. It's kind of difficult to compete with the private market. So that's a little bit more of a challenge too, to try to do your job, manage change, and do it in a pretty high degree of attrition.
Yeah, and I think that's a challenge that agencies and businesses all over the U.S. and the country are struggling with. Now, Carol, I know you've worked with a lot of DOTs. Can you share any instances where the right-of-way acquisition process significantly affected capital projects, and how is it addressed?
Well, I'd like to make one more statement on the staffing, on right-of-way staffing. Throughout the industry, there is a shortage of qualified right-of-way agents and managers, particularly the experienced project managers. And as Brad was saying, the industry as a whole, when I first got into the industry almost 40 years ago, a lot of people were trained by the DOTs. That's where the training and the agencies happened. And then some of those people got into consulting. Well, things have really changed now, and a lot of the DOTs don't have the number of staff in right-of-way, and they look to the consultant community for the right-of-way agents and project managers, and they're doing more consulting. And we have to do a better job on training our agents on the consultant side and project managers to get that experience to help the DOTs and the agencies. So I'll get off that soapbox. I've been on that for a while, but I believe in training and getting agents and project managers that experience so that it does make a difference in how you deliver your right-of-way program. So now the question you asked was some of the challenges that I've had on managing projects. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Some of the major problem, I always go back to project setup. It goes back to saying, if you get your train going on the right track, it stays on the right track. If you start a project on the wrong track, it's hard, almost impossible to back up and get it right. So at the beginning, the initial phase, the project setup is very critical. And in doing that, you determine your stakeholder and your funding requirements, the policies and procedures. And really key in that for it to be successful is understanding how decisions are going to be made and the approval processes. I've had a project where we got delayed because the agency on approving payments, approving offers, approving relocation payments, it kept going back and forth. It was not a streamlined process. So we never knew the time frame in which we could process the offers, get the funding for the offers and make the offer and get into closing and have the date for closing and make sure that we have the funding on time because of the internal inconsistencies on approval process. So how did we do that? We had to call a timeout and show where we are running into trouble, how it's impacting your budget, how it's impacting your schedule, and bring everybody to the table for a come to Jesus meeting and say, if we really are serious about meeting our budget and our schedule, things have to change because here is the effect of it. And you do that by tracking and having a report so you can sit down with the stakeholders and the decision makers and say, here's the impact, what can we do, and come to a consensus on how you can do that.
And I guess, are there any lessons learned or best practices that you have developed over time just for a successful integration of right-of-way within capital projects? And I'll let you take this over, Carol, and then Brad, you can kind of chime in there as well.
Okay, the project setup and then looking at the design phase of your project, that has caused more problems for me as a project manager, is not having input or coordination with the design engineers. We actually had agents go out the door with an offer, and while they're on their way to make the offer, call them back because there was a design change. Often a design change triggers an additional appraisal, review appraisal, which is more money and time. It could trigger another survey, title, appraisal, review appraisal. And you know that all takes time. So what I've done on my projects is at the very beginning, try to implement a right-of-way design coordinator to work with the design engineers at the beginning of the project throughout the design phase so that they can give input as to where these lines are drawn. Often you can move a line a foot in a different direction and save millions on relocation. So design, working with the design side, having right-of-way input on the design has been helpful for me in managing projects. And that's just one part.
And Brad, can you add on to that?
Yeah, I'll sort of, I agree wholeheartedly with what Carol was saying. We're very fortunate in the fact that we've got a design group that does a lot of our right-of-way layouts. So they do that back and forth with design pretty seamlessly. And are part of that process. We've also got project management teams that sort of on the larger scale capital improvement projects that we get to be involved in and provide input into kind of the concept and the final design. That said, you know, it never, it always seems like it's very hard I'm an engineer, it's very hard to put the pencil down and to leave the design at where it is. So it is incumbent on our team to really stress the fact that any kind of change really introduces a lot of complications at the end of the process. You know, I mean, you're right. If you make too many changes, it affects your appraisal. It affects kind of the acquisition negotiations that may have taken place, early conversations that you've had with the property owners. I mean, we've got some LPAs that are trying to design a project right up until letting, you know, and we've just had to say, our districts who are de facto managers in a lot of cases have had to say, just stop. You know, you've got to stop or we'll never get this project done. So managing that sort of back and forth and managing that effort is critical. I would say that if you don't manage it well, you'll never get it done in the amount of time you had. I also I want to say that we all, kind of like me doing a home project, you know, you always think it's going to take less time than it does. You know, if I estimate 2 weeks, generally it takes 4. So it's critical that we start on time in the development process. Like I say, you know, everybody's worried about the end date, but a lot of times I've found that as you progress in your development process, folks, they don't ignore the start date of the process, and they've got generally enough time to do the work that they need to get done. But a lot of times, for whatever reason, we're working on 5, 6, 10 different projects, and you just don't start at the time you need to start to get it done at the time you need. So managing that throughout the development process so that when you get to the buying right away at the tail end is critical.
And I think we can kind of segue into integrating right of way into your capital planning. And a big part of it is how can you prioritize right of way into your capital planning? And Brad, I'll start with you on that. So what can agencies do?
So, you know, some organizations are organized just a little bit differently. We formulate our capital improvement plan around a 5-year program. So that 5 years is critical. By the time you get into that 5-year plan, we generally plan out 5 to 10 years, but when you get into that 5-year window, your funding's starting to become solidified. You know, where it's coming from and where it's going to is not inflexible, but at the same time, it's not. It gets to be more and more difficult to move things around. So when you're talking right away, you know, you really don't know a lot of times what you're actually going to spend until that year one, when it's actually, you know, going to be spent, because you at the tail end of the project you get a design done, and then you get a cost estimate for it, and if there's utilities involved, quite often either they've been ignored in terms of cost estimates or severely underestimated in terms of how much it's going to take to kind of relocate those. So, you know, you tend to, if you're not plugged in early in the process, tend to be either the budget buster or the schedule buster at the tail end of a project, because you've not been adequately plugged into the process. So on our larger scale capital improvement projects, that hasn't been as much of an issue, mostly because we do have a project management team, and we do have representatives from the right-of-way bureau that are able to kind of at least, you know, provide input, hopefully shepherd the project. It doesn't always work out that way, but at least give folks advice throughout the process and stay attuned to kind of where things are going. On the smaller kind of run-of-the-mill projects, that's not the case generally, and that's where we which is the large bulk of our capital improvement plan. So a lot of times those are the ones that come off the rails, and unfortunately we don't have a good solution right now. The thing that especially when it comes to utility relocations, it's problematic because you know, utilities are very costly as a percentage of your project, especially on the run-of-the-mill projects, and if you're not trying to do that earlier in the process, I think you're going to continue, like we are, to struggle with kind of having a good estimate and having a good schedule, because we've got a couple pilot projects this year that we're trying to offer up where we're trying to do some of that utility relocation planning and costing in the 20 to 30% design complete range instead of about 65 where it typically gets done, 65 to 85. I'm not sure if that's going to be successful, but it's our attempt on at least trying to get a handle on some of those projects that sort of have blown up on us in the past.
And Carol, you talked a lot about budgeting and how to consider budgeting. How can organizations keep budgeting in mind, or what's your advice for large organizations and DOTs to keep budgeting in mind with right-of-way land acquisition, but also to prioritize it in their capital programs?
Well, I'd like to add the political aspect to the capital projects too. We often don't pay attention to what's going on in the political arena locally in these communities, dealing with mayors, city councils, and their constituents. That goes back to the community. But when you're looking at a capital program, you should pay attention to the political side, what's going on in your community, in your state at that time. Is there going to be a change in a governor? And their views on transportation is what I've seen in the past. Are they going to hold tight the purse strings? So look at that when you're looking at your capital program as well. And what was the other question, Stephanie? Sorry.
So, yes, how can agencies keep budgeting in mind for right-of-way and land acquisition in their capital programs?
Right. You have to remember and try to factor in the human factor, because your projects typically are impacting people that are not willing buyers, sellers, and people that are anxiously waiting for you to buy their property and relocate them. So you have that resistance. And what is the pulse of your community at that time? Are they the ones that you know you're going to have to take a high percentage to condemnation? Some states that I've worked in, the condemnation rate was barely 10%. Another state that I worked in, the condemnation rate was 50 to 60%. That factors into your budget. So know what's happening in your community and what is the pulse of that community and the tolerance level for your project.
And then, Brad, I don't know, how would you say your organization handles budgeting and including budgeting earlier on in the stages?
So I'd say we don't do a great job of that in terms of budgeting for the capital improvement, for the right-of-way portion of the capital improvement plan. I'd say that we do it as early as we can, and we started kind of trying to do that in year 5 to at least give folks an idea of what that potential cost could be. But at that point in time, it's really just the potential cost, right? It's not what it will be, because we really don't have a concept at that point. A lot of times we certainly don't have a final plan. So it isn't until it gets sort of ironed out in year 1 and 2 that you typically have a good idea what your real budget's going to be for acquisition. So, you know, the unfortunate piece of that is a lot of times you're stealing from another project to pay for the costs on one. So the earlier you can start planning that, at least get eyes on a particular concept or eyes on a particular project and start incorporating that into your capital improvement plan, I think that's probably best practice. I mean, for us, that the earliest we can probably do that is year 5. But a lot of times those change as you get closer to the actual letting.
And before we move on to technology, I do want to talk a little bit more about design. Design plays a big part in just the overall right-of-way process. When should you start including design in your capital programs? And either Carol, whoever wants to start, or Brad.
I'd say at the very beginning.
Yeah, agreed. The earlier.
Go ahead, Brad.
Oh, Brad, go ahead.
Sorry. No, the earlier the better. I agree with you, Carol. The earliest you can design into the capital planning, I think the better. The particularly with those problematic projects. I mean, some of the sort of more run-of-the-mill projects, it's going to be hard to sort of have the resources available to kind of feel like you're a part of that process all the way through. But especially for the larger, more complicated projects, the earlier the better.
And now we'll move on to technology, because I think design and technology play a really big role together. But what advancements in technology, such as GIS and digital mapping, have you seen that have improved just the overall land acquisition and right-of-way process? And Carol, I'll start with you, since you've worked with several agencies. What have you seen has worked well?
Yes. Well, I tell you, I'm not in therapy anymore since technology, even though even though sometimes these computers, you know, you bang your head head against the wall. But I have to say, technology from the project management perspective and as a manager over a right-of-way department, technology has made it easier for me to sleep at night. And the reason why is because we can set up your program to be in compliance, to be make sure that things are in the order that it needs to happen, and you can get your reports on a regular basis so that you can keep your finger on the pulse of your project so you're not blindsided and there's no surprises. I mean, technology has really helped me as a manager in project management. And I have to say, since technology, I have not ever been late on a project. I've met my schedule and stayed in budget because of technology. And we can spend a whole day on this. There's a lot of things that you're able to do with technology. And one thing I will add on the relocation side, look at relocation and 3D modeling. When it comes to business relocation, we solved a critical business relocation on a project in Chicago, St. Louis high-speed rail project I was on. We couldn't resolve this business relocation until we got our people in and they gave us a 3D model of what we could do with this relocation and different alternatives. And we were able to solve something very quickly and get the business. We didn't have to move it after all, we just modified it. And it really saved us time. The business owner was satisfied and the client was happy that we got the issue resolved. So I'm a big proponent of technology in right-of-way. You'll sleep better at night if you have the great technology tools.
Awesome. And Brad, what technology advances have you seen that has helped made the right-of-way process for you a lot easier?
Well, we were very fortunate for a long time to have kind of a homegrown project management application that we used to kind of make sure that our timelines were somewhat followed. It was a little complicated. We're kind of implementing a new project management software system now, which will make that a little even better and ensure kind of some of the float that typically gets eaten by the time it gets the right-of-way acquisition side of things isn't anymore. But I'd kind of bounce to the other side of the house too, property management. I mean, we're kind of implementing an inventory management system now too that really will make managing that real property asset after we've acquired it something that's critical too. I feel like for far too long we've sort of operated under the auspices of, you know, we buy and maintain, but the reality is, as a state agency, you know, buy and maintain chews up overhead, and it's you know, you're losing resources every year to do that. So you really constantly have to be able to analyze your asset that you're managing. And for us, that's real property that we've acquired for the purposes of transportation. You've got to be able to analyze that system and decide if you want to continue to manage that asset, or if it's something that you want to dispose of. You know, if it's no longer serving a transportation need or an operational need, then there's no point in having it in your organization. There's no point in owning it. And in fact, it'll continue to bring you down because it chews up overhead resources in maintaining and managing it. So we have a goal of evaluating our transportation system. You know, there's parts of our organization that analyze it from a safety perspective. There's parts of it that analyze it from a operational perspective, and are we meeting the operational needs of the traveling public? But then we have to take that information. We have to analyze it under the auspices of analyzing the property that we own. Is it something that we want to continue to own? You know, is it something that we continue to need? And if it's not, because often these are properties that are purchased in the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, up to today, you know, if it's not something that we need today, or we're not going to need in the tomorrow, then there's no point in holding on to it. So GIS and some of those technology improvements are allowing us to sort of make the jump from like a real paper-driven side of the process and trying to analyze that system with hand-drawn maps to, you know, something where we can analyze that through scripts or through, you know, criteria that we want to throw out in the GIS system to see, you know, do we really need this property anymore? So I look to some significant advances in that in the coming years, and I'm really looking forward to being able to answer those questions when people ask, you really need it anymore? And before you really couldn't answer it. You had to say, well, I think so, you know, like, but you really didn't know. So GIS is really providing that opportunity for us to really kind of manage the asset after we've acquired it.
Now, what considerations should organizations keep in mind when selecting or implementing technology solutions for their right-of-way projects? And I'll start with you, Brad, because you can probably elaborate more into that, and then I'll move over to
I think
Carol.
the thing critical is there's just so many systems out there. I mean, and integrating with all those systems. I mean, one thing I'd sort of caution everybody on is a solution that's supposed to be, you know, the solution for everything. I don't think that exists anymore because there's just too many options. So I think being data neutral, software neutral, data centric is critical. I think in integrating, being able to integrate those different systems together is crucial. So you know, saying sort of data centric, software neutral, I think probably gives you a lot more opportunity to capitalize on systems that maybe in one arena aren't the best, but in another arena are. So I'd suggest that you start off assuming that you're going to have technology changes throughout the life cycle of your organization, because you know now they're just coming faster and faster. So managing that data, what you actually need, I think, is critical.
And Carol, what recommendations do you have for organizations to keep in mind when selecting and implementing new technologies?
I agree with what Brad said, and it's true. I mean, you buy a computer, a phone, and the minute you walk out the store, it's obsolete. There's another change happening. So it's constant. Change is constant. They're constantly updating. And so I think for the organization, they have to understand their requirements, how their data is filed, how would data integration and migration happen, and do they have the proper staff in place to work with an outside firm on building or supplementing the system that they already have, and making sure that whatever you build has built-in compliance requirements, compliance for the state, the federal, local requirements are built into that to make your life a lot easier. The one thing that is really true, like what Brad was saying, is there's so many different solutions out there. Putting enough time, money, and energy into them, you can get them to work. For me, the key would be finding the solution, but also the right team, the firm that has that solution, how they're organized, how flexible are they, how do they work with you? That is really key. How responsive are they? Those are things that I would look at in my organization when I'm looking for technology solutions for right-of-way.
Well, I'm going to close the discussion and move on to audience questions because we have a lot of audience questions. So right-of-way is definitely a topic that there's so many questions and we definitely need a lot of answers to it. So I'll pass it over to Corey.
Yeah, we've been very busy fielding all of the questions coming in, and I think that reflects very positively the conversations that you all just had. So I want to start with something, Brad, that you mentioned earlier on the difficulty of finding and retaining talent. Have you seen that as you adopt more technology, that's becoming easier, or how has that affected your processes as you adopt more technology?
So we've got an amazing team here. I feel like I landed in Nirvana when I joined the Right-of-Way Bureau here. I very fortunate that we've got a very good group of folks that are very not fluent's not the right word, but very good at adopting technology and some of those things. So I feel like as we grow the talent here, it's comes with the expectation that we're going to be open to and accepting of new technology. And so I think when we don't do that, when we don't sort of press that envelope, when we don't make things easier or better, I think that's when we have real issues of retaining the folks that we want, because they want to make the process better. They want to make the transitions more seamless. So anything that we can do in terms of technology to do that, I think makes our staffing feel like they're part of that improvement, part of that making things better. So so I just say that if you have the mindset that you're not going to be sort of pushing the envelope in terms of technology or making things better, I think you're going to have a tough time just retaining talent, because people want to be a part of a good team and a good process.
That's excellent. And Carol, I see you shaking your head. Do you have anything that you want to add to building onto that? It looks like you might agree with what Brad's saying here.
I agree with what Brad said, and I know looking at our industry as a whole and trying to hire and retain people, you have to have that technology. I mean, that's just the world and the generations. I've got grandkids now that are more advanced in their early age on technology than I am. I mean, they're born into it. So the workforce, that's the future of the workforce. And if you're not into technology, and if you do not give them, the staff that you hire, the opportunity to have input into their tools and technology, then you're not going to retain them.
Yeah, absolutely. So moving on to the next question. So I'll open this up to both of you, but can the panel suggest best practices for federal agencies that need to acquire existing right-of-way?
Well, that's a good question.
Yeah, that's good. I'm not sure. It seems to be a very specific question to something that typically we work really well with our federal agencies. So if we need property that's currently in their system, in their property, or they own property that we need, or vice versa, we can generally come to some kind of an understanding or of what the true need is, and come to some kind of a working agreement. I guess I'm not sure about the specifics of that particular question. So.
Okay. Yeah, so we can move on. I think we were having a little bit of a discussion before the webinar as well. So I think this is a really interesting question. But in a community where there's an active and competitive private sector real estate market, what are some tips on how a public sector agency can compete for land acquisition with those private developers?
So I'll start, and Carol, you can jump in, because I'm sure you've got a lot to add here too. I really feel like it needs to be a symbiotic relationship. We have a lot of developers that constantly are asking questions about what our planned improvements are. They rely on kind of our capital improvement plan to plan some of the things that they have for the future, and they have planned for the future. So I think maintaining those relationships, maintaining that communication, particularly at the local level, is crucial to staying on it. We quite frequently rely on our local systems and our local planning agencies to sort of be the feeder of what we need to plan for the future, but also vice versa. We want to be a conduit for economic development here too. You know, that's the purpose of transportation, is to make lives better, right? I mean.
No, I agree. I think that there needs to be a partnership. A while ago, we had a lot of the development partnerships with government and the private developers, and it works really well. I think we need to have more of that planning and working together in sync in the development of communities.
Fantastic. And before I go on to more questions, I just, we have a lot of questions coming in, so I want to make sure, everybody knows we'll get to all of these questions. It might have to be in an email as a follow-up after the webinar, but we'll make sure we get you answers to all of these. So what kind of data are your right-of-way teams tracking and analyzing? A couple of the examples given here were costs, timing, and then what on top of that are you all looking at when you're going through this right-of-way process?
Well, I know for us, I mean, the cost, the timing, the demographics, as well, the communities that we're impacting and what's happening to the residents and the businesses in those communities. So at the end of our projects, there is, depending on the funding, you often have to give a report on the impact of your project in that community, and it breaks down the demographics. And so you do have to track the households, the type of households, the people in there, the businesses, et cetera, and have a report at the end of your project submitted for that.
So things I track generally are timing more than anything else, time and money. I mean, when it comes to projects in our capital improvement plan, we're consistently tracking how are we stacking up against the time, how are we stacking up against the money, but we're also starting to kind of incorporate things like customer experience. You know, like are we being attentive to the timelines for our customers? You know, have we reached out to them in the time that we committed to? Have we closed in the time that we committed to? You know, there's always things that we can do better there, I think, but we're starting to track those kinds of things as well.
Excellent.
Well, I'd like to add something to that too. We haven't talked enough about a good public involvement program, and that at the very beginning is what I like to track too, is what's happening on the public information side. How are those meetings going? What are we hearing from the people about the project? What's happening? I think we need to have more of that, and that is something that I pay attention to in our projects at the very beginning and throughout the project.
No, I think that's a really good point to bring up, and we had a great webinar about that a few months ago on equity and inclusion in cities. So can you talk to a little bit or elaborate a little bit on what kind of things you're looking for when you start taking that into account?
Yes, we're looking at the impact of the project in that community. And first of all, as I said at the very beginning, you need to know your project and the impact on that community. Know the community, what is happening in that community, what is that community about, and then the impact of that project. So you look at where the lines are drawing and what happens to those. So for me on my project, sitting down with the sponsor and looking at the environmental justice side of your project, what did the environmental assessment show? And then how do you address that during the delivery of your project? So that's something in the beginning that I like to do and sit down with the sponsor and the agency on the environmental impact.
I'd echo that too. I think that the difficulty sometimes, so we have a capital improvement plan that, you know, the vast majority of those projects are not your EISs. They're CEs, they're countersigned CEs, they're smaller projects that really don't have an impact, but they have an impact to the people that are out there around them. And so we, you know, in the past 4 or 5 years, we've made a conscious effort to try and get public feedback and public input on even those sort of projects. And so there is a way for our public now in Iowa to comment and respond on, and we can take a pulse of anything from a culvert replacement all the way up to, you know, like a bypass. So, you know, something that's a little bit more significant. So in terms of impact. So I think it's really important that you not only gauge your customers, your public on the larger projects where you're required to, the EAs, EISs, but I think probably gaining a little bit more of a pulse on the people that are close and kind of what they feel about projects that are next door, you know.
Yeah, I think that's incredibly important. So I'm glad, Carol, that you brought that up, and Brad, I think that's a great point. I want to be mindful of time here, so I want to ask one more question because I think it'll wrap us up nicely. So Brad, we'll start with you. What do you think are the key qualities a good right-of-way leader needs to have?
That's,
Without describing
Glad
yourself.
you went first, Brad.
that's difficult. I don't know. You know, I think flexibility more than anything, because you know, in a decent kind of even temperament, I feel as though we live in a very polarized society right now, and you know, you're dealing with people in something that's near and dear to their heart, the place they live, and the work, and maybe it's been in their family for generations, who knows? But I think having a very even keel, not being very polarized, being able to deal with people, is very crucial to a good leader in right away. I'd say that probably generally in life, not just in right away, you know.
That's right. No, I agree. I agree, Brad. That's it. The listening, I think, is key to that. Well, first of all, I tell managers, and I tell myself this: you got to get over yourself. It's not about you. You're there as a team, and you happen to be the lead of the team or the manager of the team, and make it a team effort. Listen to the team, and being flexible, as Brad says, you have to be flexible. And as I learned as I got older too, on my team, I have to have a good variety of people, because I need to learn and grow with the team as well. As a manager, I don't have all the answers. I have experience in dealing with issues and everything, but I don't have all the answers. But a good team, putting a good team together, you will have all the answers in a team effort. And so I look for having a diverse team, including the younger people who can help me with the technology side, the people who bring the technology part to the whole team. So when you have a team meeting, you have the different generations, you have different levels of experience, and you have the younger generation who can offer the technology in a different way of thinking. And that's where you have to listen and be flexible and get over yourself as a manager and be willing to adapt change. And you have to be willing to change as well.
Really good insights. All right, well, thank you both. I appreciate it. And Stephanie, I'll pass it back over to you to wrap us up here.
Yes, so thank you, everyone. Those were great insights. And we still see a lot of questions coming, so I do apologize in advance if we didn't get to all of those questions. We will follow up with everyone via email. And I do believe that right-of-way is a very, very important topic. So if you have any suggestions on what you would like to learn in future webinars, please let us know, because we can always find the right speakers to have conversations like these, because I think they really do need to be had. And I will let everyone go and enjoy the rest of your day. Bye, everybody.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thanks.